Thank you very much indeed. So now we actually have some time. I think both our experts have made really serious efforts to try to present this issue in comprehensible terms, but I've little doubt there will be questions. So, who would like to start the ball rolling? Michael McNamara, please. Again, just as we start the day, we have the convention that people introduce themselves, even if I know who they are.
Michael McNamara, I'm a TD for Clare. Just a question on Neville Cox's final point regarding the Islamic world generally and the overwhelming view on the retention of blasphemy laws. I mean, the Irish constitution, I suppose, is quite unusual in a Western context because of the protection it affords religion. But, I mean, it's not just in the blasphemy provisions. There's also Article 44, it shall hold, the state acknowledges that the homage of public worship is due to Almighty God. It shall hold his name in reverence and shall respect and honour religion. So I suppose my question is, even if the blasphemy provisions are removed, could provisions be retained prohibiting insulting religion on the basis of that article, grounded on that article? I mean, or is it just, does that article apply solely to the state, or could the state outlaw insulting religion or inciting religious hatred or intentionally offending religious belief on the basis of that article? Thanks.
Thank you. My view is that you don't even need that article to ground a law protecting religious or racial sensitivities. Frankly, within the original clause, if you'd simply said that the right was subject to public order and morality, to my mind, that would itself ground a blasphemy statute. I think that it's quite legitimate for the state to pass a statute which says we are going to limit free speech in order to protect religious sensitivities without it necessarily having an express constitutional grounding. And then, to take the point that Owen made, it would simply be a question of whether, having regard to whatever protection of free speech was in the Constitution, whether or not that new statute actually was constitutionally acceptable. So I think your point's a very good one. I don't think there's any need, and I'm not saying that the blasphemy clause should be abolished, but I'm saying I don't think you need an express reference to blasphemy in the Constitution to ground a statute which targets inciting to religious hatred, or which targets offence against religious sensitivities, or which simply targets blasphemy. I don't think you need an express constitutional imprimatur for it. I think your point's a very good one, because it is genuinely interesting as to why, given that you had such a heavily restricted freedom of speech clause which abounds with concerns to public morality, why it was felt necessary to include a specific reference to blasphemy within that clause. And I think it probably speaks volumes about the kind of dominant moral vision of the time, and the idea that in what was undoubtedly, I think in the Irish case, an extraordinary revolution to conservatism, that it would be inappropriate to have a situation where freedom of expression could be used in a blasphemous way. I think it was just reinforcing an idea that was already quite clear within the text. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Tom, please.
Tom Burke. Just a thought struck me there. If the Constitution were to retain the crime of blasphemy, should the Constitution not also define what it means by blasphemy, rather than leaving it to the legislature from time to time, or judges? Thank you.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I suppose the difficulty with that notion is that there's all sorts of words and terms of art within the Constitution which are subject to interpretation and definition. I mean, one obvious one would be the definition of the unborn within Article 43.3, but there's also other things, definition of a major criminal offence for which you need a jury. And I think the Constitution would be very long indeed if it, in its own terms, defined all the terms which might need definition or interpretation. And I think probably the approach of the Constitution is to say, well, look, to some extent, it's a document of principle which is going to have to stand the test of time and be reinterpreted from time to time to allow it to fit with contemporary standards. And we'll trust the judges to be the people who will give new life to the Constitution in each generation by interpreting controversial terms. So I think, I mean, your point's very helpful, because I think the real difficulty in terms of the Irish law, to my mind, it lay in the fact that the Supreme Court refused to define what was meant by blasphemy and said this is beyond us, and therefore killed off the thing. What's interesting in the case was they actually had a dictionary definition, a legal dictionary definition of blasphemy before them. And in an early part of the judgment, they actually referred to this dictionary definition. And it seemed to be that the way they were going was with the dictionary definition. And then in a real kind of unexpected twist, they said, we can't define this. And they didn't mention the fact that they'd already got a definition in front of them, which they'd referred to previously. And to my mind, that was a strange abdication of responsibility. It's possibly worth noting that this decision was handed down on the last day of law term, 30th of July in 1999. And the same day, the Supreme Court upheld the decision of the jury in a case called De Rossa versus Independent Newspapers, where the plaintiff had been awarded 300 grand for defamation. And there was a lot of outrage at this, at the extent to which this might impact negatively on free speech. And I've always speculated that they just didn't want to begin their summer holidays by having two judgments which would generate criticism from pro-free speech activists. But I genuinely don't know. I genuinely don't know why they didn't define it. Actually, now that I say that, that just sounds ridiculous. So I just like to regret saying that.
Okay. Too late. It's on.
It's been in my head. It's been in my mind. Now it's come out, and it's just stupid, right?
All right.
And that's on television. Excellent.
Yeah. Twitter as well. Any other comments or questions? Yes, at the back, please, PJ.
Thank you, Senator Jim Darcy. Just listening to the two speakers, and thank you very much for enlightening me so much. But what I notice, what I'm hearing is that originally blasphemy was to do with religion and protecting people's sensitivities. But what I hear now is there's a movement in looking at blasphemy not to protect people's sensitivities, but to protect the state. And words like public disorder and that indicates to me that what we're looking at now in considering blasphemy is that if we remove the blasphemy law from, or remove the crime of blasphemy from the Constitution, which itself is unusual, as you said, to have a crime in the Constitution, that somehow we might be putting the state at risk in some way. And I heard you talking about how we might even be separating ourselves further from other cultures and religions. And is that something which is relevant?
Thank you, Jim.
I'll take the first half and I'll leave the second half to Neville, just so that you get a different voice. No, there won't be any problem from a public order perspective if a blasphemy provision were removed. In the first place, because the legislation as it is currently drafted, Section 36 of the Defamation Act, doesn't actually address public order concerns anyway. And secondly, there is extensive criminal law dealing with matters of public disorder. So that if there are riots on the street for reasons of blasphemy, or riots on the street because you disagree with the FAI's choice for manager and assistant manager of the Irish football team, they'll both be caught by the public by the public order legislation. So I don't think that removing blasphemy from the Constitution or from Section 36 of the Defamation Act will make any difference from a public order perspective. As to the separating us from from other religions and so on, that was Neville's point earlier.
Okay. I just say, and I hope I wasn't unclear in this, I think blasphemy law is entirely about, as it's understood, entirely about protecting religious sensitivities. The public order thing came from the High Court judgment in Corway, and it was essentially the judge trying to work out a standard as to whether someone could take a private prosecution. In other words, I've no doubt that if you're looking at a police prosecution for blasphemy, you wouldn't need, on that analysis, to have to show public order, potential public order problems. I think it would all be about protecting sensitivities. The point about the Organisation of Islamic Cooperation, look, the reason I would have mentioned that is simply this. Within the United Nations, and I think within the world, you've got an ongoing and developing clash between two major cultures. I think that United Nations values, as reflected in international human rights documents, have for 60 years been largely Western in origin and have largely ignored minority communities, be they Islamic or African, not least because at the time when the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which is, I mean, is a troubling document in some ways, in the sense that if it claims genuinely to reflect the values of all people, this document was created at a time when most Islamic states and most African states were colonized, so they weren't given a voice. And I think what you're having now is an emerging consensus within the Islamic world that in fact they disagree with a lot of the approaches which are taken within the Western world to the balancing of rights and values. So for example, within our culture, I don't think there would be massive outrage at the idea of a law which existed effectively to prevent the publication of outrageous forms of racism. But I think there would be an equivalent concern if the law existed to protect people in respect of religious sensitivities. And I think you got this when the 2009 Act dealt with blasphemy, and absolute outrage at the existence of this. And the point that I was simply making is that different cultures take different views as to what is the magic and unacceptable word that can't be said. I've tried to get, as part of an exercise in a class, I asked students, what's the most offensive word you can think of? And they all inevitably say one of two. It's either the N word or the C word. And to make the point, I say, well, look, would you mind saying the word? And in 9 cases out of 10, they won't actually say the word, especially the N word. They won't say it. It becomes something which just can't come out of their mouth. And in those circumstances, I think you have a situation where different cultures just don't like certain things because they strike at some sort of grounding moral proposition that there are unsayable terms. And my point is simply that within the Islamic world, I think you get this because of a really kind of heightened concept of what reverence entails. I think you get this in terms of religious sensitivities. Does this mean that this is something which this group should consider? Well, I don't think necessarily so. This isn't an Islamic state. On the other hand, if we are to be genuinely pluralistic and cognizant of the growing Islamic population, it possibly is something which should be borne in mind. Owen and I both spoke before the All-Party Committee on the Constitution on free speech. And I was really surprised, when we were dealing with this issue, I was really surprised within this group of the degree to which members were genuinely sensitive to the interests of the growing Islamic population, and also those people, the kind of slightly more silent group, who from other religious faiths would be really, really grossly offended by blasphemous publications. It's worth making the point that in 1997, Tommy Tiernan appeared in the Late Late Show, did a brief sketch to do with the Lamb of God and Mass and so on, and it took him, 4 or 5 hours after the programme ended to be let out of RTE because of the amount of protesters outside the station in Montrose at that time. And that's not that long ago, you know.
Thank you. I'm going to take two questions now that I had seen already because we're going to run into time issues. Firstly, PJ and then Angus.
PJ Murray. I'm just wondering what relevance has the preamble to the provisions for blasphemy in the Constitution?
Thank you. And Angus Osnadi.
Very briefly, I was wondering the list of countries that you mentioned there to do with laws. Is there a case where secular republics have any such provisions within their constitutions? Because I'm just wondering, because that's more appropriate to what we're debating today, is the constitution of other republics.
So I'll take the first question, and Owen's going to take the second question. To what extent is the preamble relevant? I think the preamble and the whole text is generally relevant in this regard, in that it explains the definitional contours within which the Constitution works. So I think it is the existence of the blasphemy clause is explainable by reference to the fact that this is quite clearly and quite purportedly a highly religious document, and from the by reference to other Western European constitutions, it's an unusually religious constitution. Does it demand a blasphemy clause? Absolutely not. Does it justify one? Absolutely yes. Would it be inconsistent if you removed the blasphemy clause but left the preamble the way it is? No, I don't think so.
The second question, the answer is very simple. Most other jurisdictions, most other secular republics that deal with issues of blasphemy, the table in Appendix 2, for example, do so at a statutory level. Just picking up Neville's point there, the presence or absence of the word blasphemy in the Constitution, or more to the point, the absence of the word blasphemy in the Constitution is neutral as to whether there can or should be a blasphemy statute of some sort. So that what tends to happen is that the various constitutions will say things like free speech is important, there can be restrictions for various grounds, like the grounds in Article 10, subsection 2, and then on the basis of the scope afforded by the generous exceptions in 10.2 and the equivalent clauses in the local constitutions, legislation is enacted. So it's almost always done at the legislative level. It's impossible to prove a negative, and I don't speak every language in the Council of Europe, but on the basis of what the research that Neville has done that I'm stealing, I think we're unique in this respect. Most of the time, the Constitution says general things like maybe public order or public morality or something like that, and leaves it to the legislature to fill in the details, because there are lots of things that raise public order concerns and lots of things that raise public morality concerns. Blasphemy is only one of them. So not a constitutional issue, usually a statutory issue.
We've time for one last question. John, I saw you. Could we have a microphone in front, please? Mary, here. No, Mary, sorry, here. Yeah, thanks.
John Lardner. I just wondered what opinion you had for the inclusion in the retainment of the law of blasphemy in the Constitution, if it worked, if it could be prosecuted effectively, when you take into account what happened in the Scandinavian countries in recent years. People died as a result of what happened afterwards.
The Danish cartoons you told me.
Yes.
I think my general view is that in that particular context, where there were sort of acts of criminality, and one point to bear in mind is that people say, the Islamic reaction to blasphemy is to engage in violence. That, for me, is the single most racist statement I've heard in the Western media, because it's got 1.5 billion Muslims in the world, very sporadic acts of criminality. To me, it's as racist as saying all Jews are mean, all black people loot, all women are can't think of anything else. There you go.
A good escape.
It's
Obviously, what Neville means to say is all women are scary.
Yeah. Anyway, anyway, my point is that the vast bulk of Islamic reaction was entirely peaceful, and I just, it's something that I know it's not what you're saying, but it's just something that generally concerns me. I suppose two things. First of all, I think that the fact that there was illegal actions flowing from or connected to the exercise of a constitutional right doesn't mean that you should limit the constitutional right. You should target the illegal actions. That would be my normal view. If people are going to engage in criminality because they don't like the publication of something, whether it's the budget speech or a blasphemy, you target the illegal action. You don't say, well, that's a reason to limit the constitutional right. It really is kind of giving in to hostage takers. I think that the issue concerning, say, the Danish cartoons or, you know, the YouTube film Innocence of Muslims, which was controversial last September, I think what it does give us pause for thought and perspective is that there are certain things which within our culture, and from, I imagine many people in this room, just simply wouldn't raise any hackles, and you'd say, maybe I don't like this, but it's not something that's going to hugely upset me. If you look at the general reaction, though, in any fair way, say to Muslims in Bradford at the publication of Satanic Verses or the Danish cartoons, is you do see a genuine reaction of absolute horror at what's happened. And you do see it also being connected with other concerns connected with, say, equality. So one of the points that the Danish Muslims would have said is, this is simply an attempt to stereotype Islam as a terrorist organization. We've been battered by the West from the time of the Crusades, and this is just another attempt to marginalize our community. The British Muslims at the time of Satanic Verses said that it was just used by racists as a way to target their community. So when Bradford City Football Club was playing at away matches, and they would have a substantial Muslim population, the crowd was chanting Rushdie, Rushdie. Now, Rushdie wasn't playing, right? This was simply, maybe he was in hiding. This is simply an attempt to bring out a kind of racism. And I think what the UN resolutions in respect to defamation of religion all say is, look, the concept of blasphemy is in fact a way in which the dignity of members of certain religious groups is being systematically undermined. And therefore it's important, as part of a balancing of rights and interests, to limit free speech, to prohibit blasphemy, in order to protect the dignity of members of these groups. Now, is that true? I don't know. I kind of tend to the view that where something like Holocaust denial is prohibited, it's not because individuals are wounded, it's because the soul of the nation is being hurt. And the nation rises up and reasserts itself and says, that's an unspeakable term. And I think within the Islamic world, it's quite logical to say that blasphemy will reach that level. To my mind, to the extent that it doesn't reach that level in Ireland, that the soul of the nation is outraged by this, and therefore it shouldn't be said, it might perhaps be more advisable to be looking at statutory treatment to prohibit incitement to hatred or whatever. I think, though, your point is a really strong one, because it's controversies like the Danish cartoons controversy, where you see people being really, really genuinely badly hurt in a way which people in this room mightn't understand if they don't share the same belief system and the same kind of conception of the importance of reverence. I think it does give us pause for thought, even in a secular society, if that secular society is also pluralistic.
Thank you very much. I want to thank both Neville and Owen for, I think, both excellent papers and really very, very good responses.